Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. My name is Dejan Aleksić. I'm coming from CTI Digital, and you can follow me on Twitter, but I don't tweet too much. We'll be covering here Pattern Lab and atomic design in Drupal. We will include some Twig tips. We will talk about Tailwind CSS, how it's awesome, and how it well works with the above. If there is time, we will talk a little bit about Vue.js, how it's definitely better than jQuery, and how it can be more useful than for Drupal projects. And of course, we will wrap all of that into CTI's Drupal 8 team named Rutherford. Okay, first let's talk a little bit about Pattern Lab and atomic design. What is Pattern Lab? How many of you have heard about Pattern Lab or used it? Okay. It's essentially a static site generator, but it provides a lot more functionalities. Patterns can be looked at components or parts of some components. From the right side, you can see the image is really shrinked, but you can clearly see that from the top there are smaller components, and on the bottom you have complex components or complete pages. Pattern Lab is good because it provides tools such as link. You can share the link with among the team for specific component. I will do a demonstration later. You can test patterns in isolations, and it's largely independent of any backend technology. So you can basically start working on the project without having Drupal installed, which is really good for front-end developers. All components live in Pattern Lab's directory, and components are broken into atoms, molecules, and organisms. Each component has CSS or SCSS, JavaScript, documentation in Markdown, markup, which is in Twig, and example content that we fill those components with in YAML format. What are advantages of this approach is that we don't spread code across the whole project. We have one directory per component. It's easy to find or share components between projects. And of course, it's much easier to delete things without leaving code behind. This is directory structure of one component that's called featured social channels. And as you can see, there is YAML file for that default or markup default content. There is a Twig for template, Markdown for documentation of that component, JavaScript, CSS, and there is others smaller parts of that components that we include in the main Twig file. This is how that looks like. This is how we include, for example, that organism that we talked about, featured social channels, and how we defined variables that we defined previously in that pattern with variables fields from Drupal. And this is example for that YAML file that we talked about. We need to have some content to show, to display, or to test those components in Pattern Lab. Now, a little bit, I will try to do this quickly, about atomic design. It consists of atoms, which are the smallest parts. Things like heading, style, buttons, body text, things like that, or image. Then there are molecules, which combines several atoms. For example, accordion item can be named molecule because it usually contains heading atom, icon atom, and some text or paragraph. And organisms are fully functional combinations of those molecules and atoms. For example, accordion, completely working accordion is one organism. There are, of course, also templates, which allows you to create and combine those components with some default content. And they behave something like wireframes. And lastly, there are pages, which behave more like design or mockups with content that will be used on the project. Ideally, in CTI, we would like in the future to replace PSDs and InVision files with Pattern Lab pages, real pages. This is how that looks like. This is a screenshot taken from Instagram page. Brad Frost is author of the Pattern Lab and that approach. And this is how he explained what is atomic design, basically. We have the smallest components on the first part of the image. Then we have combinations of several atoms to combine into a little bit bigger components. Then we have organisms, templates that hold some default content, and pages, lastly, with finished completely with real content. This is, of course, interesting GIF to see how that can look like on a real project. It's also taken from Brad Frost's site. Okay, how this work with Drupal? We will talk about this. Atomic design and Pattern Lab. Pattern Lab and Drupal can be integrated. That is really a good thing because we couldn't do all the fancy stuff if we couldn't be able to integrate it somehow. We in CTI took Emulsify project as a starting point, and we just then added some new features or removed others. We will talk about that, but we used it as a starting point. So in order to integrate Drupal and Pattern Lab, you need to have components module because it allows you to reference paths to those Pattern Lab templates. Of course, there are a lot of useful plugins that we will talk about that allows us to easily create those templates or get some parts of the content. This is the part that lives in info file, and this is how we reference to the top level paths of each of those components. We have base that holds basically just CSS and then some basic styling on configuration. Then there are atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. It lives in info YAML file of Drupal 8 team. We use this bamboo twig module that really does a lot, and but we basically use it for rendering entities, views, blocks, but it can also work on a bit lower level. For example, here we are rendering an image that uses specific image style, which is really handy now when we work completely on the front end in template files. We don't use any other like display suite or panels or stuff like that. Everything is in the files, in templates for better and easier control. We will talk about pros and cons of each of those approaches. This is an example how we include the organism named site header. And here are the fields that we created in that organism or in atoms that are included in the organism. And this is how we reference block with bamboo render block or render a form with bamboo render form function. This is just a small example how we use it. There is, of course, twig field value module that allows us to write better twig and to more easily get field label, for example, or field value of specific field. Because when you have rendered arrays, sometimes those variables that you need to use look too long or not too good looking. It's easier to read this way. So this module helps. There are several twig tricks that we need to use. I will just mention a few, like first, trim, upper, lower, of course render if you need to pass the HTML to a component, or these loop variables that are really handy in the templates. We tend to use skint because it allows us to get the entity. We prefer Kint more than Twig Xdebug because it allows us to take some values from the entities better than that we can do with Twig Xdebug. There is a really interesting article from my colleague, Phil Wolstenholme, on Medium about Kint tips in Twig. So I recommend to read that. It contains really handy stuff when you start working with Pattern Lab and files. Now we need to put all of that together. And this is how one a bit more complex organism looks like. We have channel referencing to channel with paragraph. We have heading summary. We have some bamboo render image style. We just reference those values. We don't have logic in these template files, Drupal template file, just referencing fields that we initially created in Pattern Lab. So now you might ask, is it all of this work worth the hassle? Because Drupal has a lot of cool site building modules. And I will try to explain some of the pros and cons of this approach. Well, at first, competitors are using Pattern Lab and Atomic Design, so clients are asking for it. There is a single source of truth, so all the logic for templates and components live in files, so it always stays up to date. That is a living style guide. It's easier to update it than, for example, PDF or InVisions. You can also use on meetings with the clients, just start DevTools and some classes and modify that component. It's of course good for testing and demoing components in isolation. I will do a demonstration later to see how that looks like. And the main part for me is that it unblocks front-end development. You don't have to wait site to be configured in order to start doing the work. You just need to have design and then start building components and pages. Of course, there are a lot of pros in helping in encouraging consistency across code or duplication of error. It's easy to see where a component lives and what it has. Directory structure, markup control, all that stuff is much easier to do with Pattern Lab. Now we need to introduce Tailwind and utility first CSS. What is that? Well, basically, atomic or utility classes represent a single CSS property, like text center, flex, text h1, margin bottom 2, etc. We use those classes from Tailwind to quickly compose components in the browser or in templating language, like Twig. Majority of styling comes from the classes in HTML, rather than having all the styling in CSS files. So we move that weight to the HTML. This is a chit-chat component, and you can see it has a pretty simple markup, but it's very tied to this one specific component. What if later we want to reuse that component to create a similar one? It contains a large block in CSS, and how many display flex or margin 0 auto does one style sheet basically need? There is, for example, component author created this chat notification logo wrapper, which holds only flex shrink 0. That can be achieved with a simple class and repeated afterwards. So basically, when we implement Tailwind, this component looks like this. It has, of course, much more classes, but you can easily understand how that component will look like. And of course, CSS coming from a central pool, so it's much easier to reuse those classes. And of course, when developers gets familiar with the classes, all development becomes more faster. Now, you might think that this looks like inline styles. Well, only in the part that utility class lives inside of the HTML. The rest of it lives in CSS, which means that we can still use media queries and pseudo elements, that we can use pre or post CSS processors. We can use caching, linting. We can use APIs designed to handling CSS classes. Then second argument might be that there is too much freedom in this approach. And in our experience, CTI, it was the opposite. We basically forced a specific system and errors were minimal. It's great for consistency or highlighting inconsistencies in CSS. Some others developers might say that their HTML looks bloated now. Well, utility, as I mentioned before, moves the weight from the CSS to HTML. Now, next topic, what about performance? We tend to set the whole CSS file per page, so that is where gzip shines in a repetitive text. And main performance benefit comes from the maintaining of those components. And developers can feel much more confident updating or removing those components. Of course, when you work only in Twig, you should never repeat yourselves. There are options to include or embed specific components and just modify some of its values. Okay, now when we saw some advantages, let's talk a little bit more about those advantages. There is a big advantage in speed. You can basically just create components in the browser and then just copy classes to the Twig template file. It's great for prototyping. You spend less time trying to second guess the cascade. The cascade is a big problem of CSS. Sometimes it helps, but sometimes it can be really difficult to fight with. Refactoring is much easier and stressful. When you see, for example, an anchor with a class of margin bottom 2, background green, white, so 2 points from the sides, you know how that component can look like, and that is not the case, for example, if you have a link with a class of button and button primary. That can look completely different depending on the context. So, Tailwind is basically a post-CSS plugin that outputs CSS for you. It has JavaScript config file that is project specific, that has configuration for colors, fonts, spacing, breakpoints. And what that means is that you can export that configuration. Since it's in JavaScript, you can export to YAML to use, for example, for breakpoints. So you just define breakpoints on one place and use it on YAML or JSON for pattern lab, or export to CSS file as a variable. There are, of course, a lot of third-party plugins that help you to extend functionalities that Tailwind can offer. So, how well does this work with Drupal? Well, it works very well with atomic design. It's definitely fewer regressions, bugs, and unintended styling, and in our opinion. It's easier to add nice effects, animations, etc. Cons are maybe that project needs to have a component-based design. We don't recommend it in Drupal 7 because there is no Twig. Sometimes Cascade can be useful, as colleagues before me talked about CSS and variables that cannot be used in this approach. Okay, learning curve, there are a little bit problem with learning curve, but after some time developers get familiar with the classes and it's much easier to do it. We use this Rutherford team on CTI new builds, Drupal 8 projects, and we also added to some of the inherited projects to try to tame the new CSS that is added. Now a little bit about Vue.js. Vue.js is coming from the same family as React or Angular. It's called Progressive JavaScript Framework. What we like about it more than others, because it's easy to add to existing markup to make certain specific parts of it reactive. It focuses on Vue layer out of the box, but you can add more to it. Vue in Drupal, we need to be careful with that because it uses the same delimiters, double curly braces, but you can fix that with this verbatim prefix before and after. You can, of course, set different delimiters in a Vue config, or you can create a Vue if, vif, and work that way, alternative way. Now a little bit about Rutherford. Its name, it's arrived from the Ernest Rutherford, who is a British scientist. It's the first foray into atomic design in CTI. How it's different from the Emulsify that we started with is that there is no Emulsify's gulp config. We use only npm scripts that can either call JavaScript or bash scripts. Using only npm brings us closer to the tools that we are using, so you don't have to, for example, for compiling Sass, you don't have to download Sass plugin, but just default one. And each of the scripts has its own atomic purpose, so we have a lot function. There is this NTL package that helps us find the commands that we need. What are the benefits of this approach? Quality. With this, having everything in templates with Pattern Lab allows us to introduce some plugins such as slint, stylint, prettier, for example. It can be run in the editor. For example, if you want to stage some file, if it has error, we can show you an error and you need to fix it before you can commit. Of course, we use visual regression testing, provide with back to stop. There are a lot of advantages from performance side. We tend to minify CSS and JavaScript with source maps. GIFs, PNGs, JPEGs, and SVGs are automatically optimized. Images are lazy loaded by default. Pages are prefetched. So when the user is idle and fast connections, it loads much faster. And really good thing is that we remove unused utility classes from the production CSS with purge CSS, which is really handy. I will talk and demonstrate a little bit about accessibility in the team. Okay, now I can do a small demonstration to see how that looks like in reality. Okay, this is accordion component. As you can see, it's a fully working one. What's cool with this is what I mentioned. You can take this URL, of course, once it's deployed to some server, you can share among your team, and they can see the same as you. There are pattern information. Here you can see the twig markup that it's needed for this organism to show on your page. There is also an HTML, a rendered HTML. As you can see, we are attaching library accordion here, and of course, when it's converted into HTML, you can use this in your editor, save it and run it, and it will show the same as here. And of course, you have a reference here to see from what components is this organism made of. And this is accordion item. It's a molecule that is contained into accordion component. I will show you some a bit more complex ones. For example, this is a page header with no search organism. We have some variations like page header regular with search, or page header with carousel functionality. And of course, it's a working one. You can also use some of the tools that I mentioned before from Pattern Lab that to test this component in isolation. So you can really do stuff like this and demonstrate that to the clients, and it's really handy. Okay, let's show some other ones. For example, standout content. It's also an organism. You can show its information about that component, and of course see from which components is this organism created of. So lastly, I would like to show you the complete page. This is what we saw on one of the slides. It's a complete Pattern Lab page of all components, all the settings that team has. As you can see, this is good. This is contrast checker, color contrast checker for each of the colors that team has. Later, we can see, of course, defined colors. It's all basic from the start. Here are the breakpoints, shadows, etc. To the a bit more complex ones, layouts, and the organisms that I mentioned before. And you can work on each of those components in isolations, test, share, etc. Phil Wolstenholme is a colleague of mine in CTI Digital. It's a senior developer, and he's the main author of the Rutherford team. Please follow him on Twitter. And he is a really nice guy to work with, so I thank him a lot for sharing the work on this. And yeah, it's a pleasure to work on a project like this. Thank you. Okay. The first question is for Anonymous. How are you, and what is your atomic name? My name is Dejan. It's atomic enough. Second question is more serious. I like your approach. Did you find the switching to Tailwind process hard? Well, it has a lot of difference comparing to the standard traditional approach. Since I already worked previously on Pattern Lab and worked, of course, with Bootstrap. Bootstrap has some sides of Atomic, but it's not completely. I saw a lot of benefits using this approach, and I really enjoy working on it. CSS is written, we don't have to invent it every time, and utility classes are really good because we concentrate on the things that are more important, creating components that are user-friendly, that are reactive, that has a lot of animations. It just opened a new door for front-end development. So yes, it wasn't too hard for me, but it's definitely much more different than traditional way of doing front-end in Drupal. Any more question?